A few weeks ago, I received a long, very long message from a follower of the channel. Her name is Valentina. She is 34 years old and currently lives in Bogota, although the story she shared with me took place in the town where she grew up, a small place in the mountains that she never wanted to name exactly. She told me that she wrote it all in one go, without stopping, because she needed to get it out before it swallowed her whole. Before I take you to what Valentina experienced, if you have an experience that has haunted you and you want me to share it here, leave it in the comments or write to me. Sometimes telling is the only way to let go. Now let me take you to the summer when Valentina returned to her childhood town and discovered that there are inheritances that no one chooses, but that still come to collect. I was 7 years old the last time I saw my grandmother alive. I don't remember her clearly, in that vivid way one remembers things they love. I remember her more like one remembers a disturbing dream, in fragments, in sensations, in the smell of bitter grass that came from her room and that I never quite knew how to name. I remember her hands, long and dark, always busy with something I couldn't see. I remember that the people of the town respected her, but not in the way one feels for wise elders. It was another kind of respect, the kind that comes from fear. My mother took my cousin Lucia and me away from that town when my grandmother died. There was no wake that we attended, nor a burial that they took us to. One day my mother simply packed our bags with an efficiency that seemed strange to me even at that age, and we left for the city. We never returned. For years I asked about the town, about the house, about what we had left behind, and my mother always found a way to steer the conversation elsewhere. Over time, I stopped asking. I grew up. I studied graphic design. I got clients, a small apartment, an orderly life. So, last year, my mother died. It wasn't sudden, but in the slow and cruel way that some diseases have, and I was with her until the end. It was during those last days, when lucidity came and went like the tide, that she started talking about the village. She said disconnected things, or at least that's what I thought at first. She mentioned names. She mentioned dates. One night, I think it was 2 weeks before she died, she took my hand with a strength that didn't seem possible in someone so frail and said to me, "Don't go looking for what we left behind. Promise me." I promised her because it was what she needed to hear. She died 10 days later, and I was left with that promise like a weight on my chest, and also with something else, curiosity, which is the most dangerous thing there is. I found the name of the village among his papers. I also found a rusty key inside an unmarked envelope, and inside the envelope a folded piece of paper with an address written by hand. The address was that of a house. I recognized it. It was my grandmother's house. I told myself that I would just go see what was left, that perhaps there were assets to manage, documents, some legal responsibility that my mother had left pending. I told myself I was an adult and rational person, that there was nothing to fear in an old house that was probably in ruins. I told myself all that with the conviction of someone who is lying to themselves. The town was 4 hours away from Bogota. I called my cousin Lucia to tell her what I had found. She was silent on the other end of the line for a moment that felt too long before saying, "Valentina, don't go." I asked her why. She said, "Because I went 3 years ago and was sick for a month after returning. I don't know what that place is, but something is not right there." I told her it was probably just a coincidence. She said, "Yes, probably," but it didn't seem to me that she believed it. I went anyway. I left early on a Friday, with my small car, with a suitcase for a weekend, with the rusty key in the pocket of my coat. The road to the village climbs up a mountain road that at some point stops being a dual carriageway and becomes something more like a path than a public road. The trees begin to close in. The light changes. It's not that it gets dark, but that it becomes different, as if the sun that reaches there had passed through a filter that no one deliberately installed. I arrived in the village around noon. It was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps my childhood memory had amplified it. A central square with a fountain that no longer worked. A church with white walls and peeling plaster. A store, a couple of houses, dogs that looked at me from the sidewalks with a calmness that didn't seem natural. There were very few people outside, and those who were looked at me in a way I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't hostility. It was something closer to recognition, as if they were expecting me, which was impossible because I hadn't notified anyone. I found the house without difficulty. It was at the edge of the village, almost where the houses ended and the mountain began. It was a low construction, with walls made of wattle and daub painted a white that time had worn to gray. It had a thick wooden door, locked with a padlock. I used the key. The padlock yielded without resistance, which seemed strange to me given how long it had been unused. Inside, it smelled of something I recognized immediately. That same bitter herb from childhood. It was impossible for the scent to linger after so many years, and yet there it was, intact, as if someone had burned something that very morning. The rooms were empty of furniture, but not of things. There were jars on the kitchen shelves with contents I couldn't identify. There were marks on the floor of the main room, traced with what looked like charcoal in patterns I didn't recognize, but that caused me immediate physical discomfort. The same feeling one gets from staring at something nonsensical for too long. In the center of the room, there was a small table on which lay an object covered with a black cloth. I didn't uncover it. Not yet. I told myself I needed air first. I went outside and stood in the small, dry dirt yard looking at the mountain behind the house. It was then that I heard footsteps on the gravel beside me and turned to find an old woman looking at me with light eyes that didn't match the rest of her dark, wrinkled face. She said to me, "You are Rosalba's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. I said yes. She nodded slowly. I asked her how she knew. She said, "Because you have her same hands." I looked at my hands, long and dark. I had never noticed it that way. The old woman's name was Doña Carmenza, and she told me she had been my grandmother's closest neighbor for over 40 years. She invited me to her house for panela water, and I accepted because something in the way she looked at me told me that she knew things I needed to know. We sat in her wooden corridor overlooking the empty street. She prepared the panela water leisurely and then sat across from me and asked me directly, "Do you know why you came back?" I told her no, that I thought it was to see the house. She shook her head. She said, "You came because the time has come. It always comes." I asked her what she meant by that. She took a long sip from her cup before answering. What she told me that afternoon, sitting in that corridor while the town fell silent around us, is what I will try to reproduce as accurately as possible, not because I expect you to believe it, but because I need it out of me. My grandmother, according to Doña Carmenza, had been what people in the village called a rezandera, which is a term that can mean many things depending on who you ask. Some rezanderas are pious women who accompany mournings and know ancient prayers. Others are something more complicated. My grandmother was something more complicated. The people of the village brought her problems that the doctor couldn't solve and that the priest didn't want to hear, and she resolved them. Rare diseases, grudges that wouldn't yield, businesses that wouldn't thrive, loves that didn't come to fruition. She resolved them in ways that Doña Carmenza described carefully, as if she chose each word so that it wouldn't sound worse than it already did. But all of that had a cost. And the cost, Doña Carmenza told me, was not paid by my grandmother. Or not completely. It was paid by something she had summoned many years ago, in the times when she was young and desperate, on a night that no one witnessed but left marks on her forever. She never spoke of that night directly, but her neighbors saw it in her, in the change that occurred from one month to the next, in how she went from being an ordinary woman to someone whom people feared and at the same time sought out. That something she had summoned had demands. Doña Carmenza did not call it a demon, but used a word in a very low voice that I could not quite hear, or perhaps did not want to. And one of the demands, she told me, was that the bond did not end with my grandmother's death. It continued. There was always a descendant, a woman with the same long, dark hands, and that bond sought her out. Sooner or later, I asked her why my mother had taken us out of the village. Doña Carmenza said to me, "Your mother spent her life fleeing, and she succeeded for a long time." She paused. "You did not flee. You returned." I entered my grandmother's house again when the sun was already setting. This time I went straight to the main room. I stood in front of the small table. The black cloth was still on top of the object. I could feel something nameless, a presence that was not exactly a pressure, but rather its absence, as if the air around that table weighed less, as if something was consuming it. I uncovered it. It was an old black clay bowl, cracked but not completely broken. Inside there was dry earth and something that at some point had been a plant but was now just dark dust. And in the center of that dust was a tiny figure, carved from what seemed like bone. with a vaguely human shape but with incorrect proportions, the arms too long, the head slightly tilted as if listening to something. The moment I saw it, the exact moment my eyes landed on that figure, I heard a sound. It didn't come from outside or from any specific point in the room. It came from inside my own head, like when one hears a high-pitched tone after a blow, but it wasn't a tone. It was something that resembled breathing, slow, steady, interested. I covered the bowl again. That night I slept in the car, parked in the town square, with the doors locked and the heating on even though it wasn't cold enough to justify it. I didn't sleep well. Every time I fell asleep, I saw the same fragments. A moonless night, an open space I couldn't place, a figure of distorted proportions approaching from afar with a slowness that was worse than speed, and my own hands extended in front of me, waiting to receive something. At 6 in the morning, when it was just starting to get light, someone knocked on my window. I woke up suddenly with my heart in my throat. It was Father Esteban, the town priest, a man in his 60s with a face that looked like he hadn't slept well in several days. He gestured for me to roll down the window. I did. He told me without preamble, "Doña Carmenza informed me that you were here." I said yes. He said, "I need you to listen to something important before I do anything else with what I found in that house." We sat on the steps of the church. The town was still asleep around us. He spoke to me for almost an hour, and what he told me contradicted some things that Doña Carmenza had said, but it agreed on the essentials. Yes, my grandmother had made a pact. Yes, that pact had a logic of inheritance that he couldn't explain theologically but had seen operate in that town more than once. And yes, the object that was in the house was the center of that bond. What he told me additionally, and what Doña Carmenza hadn't told me, was that the bond was not indestructible, that there was a way to end it, that my grandmother had known, but had chosen not to, because ending the bond meant renouncing the power it gave her and she hadn't wanted to, that perhaps my mother had known it too, but had preferred to flee, that I now had an option that the two previous ones had not exercised. I asked him what that way was. He hesitated. Then he said, "The object has to be destroyed in a specific way, and it has to be done by a descendant, not by someone outside. If someone outside tries to destroy it, it doesn't work. That has already been attempted." I asked him when. He looked at me. 3 years ago, a young woman came to the village, entered the house, tried to break the bowl. I then understood what had happened to Lucia, the month-long illness she had attributed to coincidence. I asked him how it was destroyed. He explained to me. It was a process that involved a specific prayer that he would write on a piece of paper, fire, and take the remains outside the property before dawn completely. He told me there was a risk, that during the process something would try to dissuade me, that he hadn't seen it done the same way twice, that it could be a sound or an image or a thought that wasn't mine, that the instruction, the only instruction, was not to interrupt the process once it had begun. That night I did it. There was moonlight, which I appreciated, although I don't quite know why. I entered the house with a candle, the paper with Father Esteban's prayer, and a lighter. The marks on the ground seemed darker than the day before, or maybe it was the light. I went to the main room. I uncovered the bowl for the second time. The bone figure was in a different position. I was sure I had left her with her head tilted to the left. Now it was upright, with her head looking up at me. I started to read the prayer aloud. It was in Old Spanish, with some words I didn't recognize, and Father Esteban had told me to pronounce them as best I could, even if I didn't understand them. I read slowly. The candle cast shadows that moved more than the movement of the flame justified. It was when I reached the middle of the prayer that it started. First was the breath, the same as the night before, inside my head, but closer now, more defined, and with it a thought that came with a terrifying clarity, that it wouldn't end, that there was no need to end anything, that I could have what my grandmother had, the power to resolve what the doctor and the priest could not resolve, the hands capable of things that other hands could not. The thought had a voice that was not exactly a voice but functioned like one, and the voice had a warmth. I kept reading. The thought became more insistent. It offered me concrete things, things I wanted, some of which I had never said out loud. My mind produced them with a clarity that made me doubt for a moment whether those thoughts were mine or theirs, if there was a distinction. I kept reading. When I finished the sentence, I placed the lit paper in the bowl. The dry earth and plant dust caught fire quickly. The bone figure took longer, but it ignited. There was a smell I couldn't describe, not exactly unpleasant, something between resin and wet earth and something else that has no name. What happened while it burned was the hardest to put into words. I heard, with my ears and not just in my head, a sound that was almost a language but not quite. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I understood the tone. It was the tone of something that did not expect this outcome, that had hoped that I, like my grandmother and like my mother, would choose differently. And in that tone, there was something I interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as indignation, like the surprise of someone who has collected a debt for generations and suddenly finds that someone is not paying it. I took the remains when the fire went out. Earth, dust, charcoal, fragments of the bowl broken by the heat. I put them in a cloth bag that I had brought prepared. I left the house before dawn was finished and walked to where the road leaving the village turned into a mountain, and there I buried the bag under a tree that I chose without any particular criteria, just because it was there. I returned to the car. I started it. I began to go down the mountain. They were the 4 longest kilometers of my life. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. Nothing. The silence inside my head was so complete, so different from what it had been during the last hours, that it almost hurt. It was the silence of a frequency that is cut off, the silence of something that is leaving. When I reached the main road and the path became 2 lanes, I pulled the car over to the side and sat still for several minutes. I realized I was crying. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't pure relief, nor was it pure sadness. It was something in between, the feeling of having closed something that had been open for decades, something I didn't even know was open. I called Father Esteban to tell him I had finished. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "May God be with you, miss." And he hung up. I called Lucia. I told her everything. She also fell silent for a while, and then she asked me, "How do you feel?" I told her the truth. I still didn't know. In the weeks that followed, I noticed some things. That I was sleeping differently, more deeply, and with fewer dreams. That my hands, my long dark hands, looked the same as always, but I looked at them differently, with less discomfort. That certain ideas that had floated in my mind since childhood, ideas that I always believed were my own but perhaps were not entirely, were no longer there. I did not return to the village. The house is still there, I suppose. Doña Carmenza is still there, I suppose. Father Esteban, too. There is one thing I still don't know for sure and probably never will. Whether what I did worked, or if what I did was simply what that wanted me to believe I was doing. Whether the destruction of the object was the end of the bond, or if the bond has ways of persisting that I don't understand, and that will only become evident later on. Sometimes, in that space between sleep and wakefulness, I hear something. Very distant. Like a breath that isn't mine, but only very occasionally, and less each time. I hope so. So far this is what Valentina wrote to me. She says that since then she hasn't returned to the village, and that she doesn't plan to do so either. What struck me about her story was not so much what happened in that house, but the image of 3 women, her grandmother, her mother, and herself, each facing the same inheritance in completely different ways. If you have a story that has haunted you, something you need to get out, I invite you to share it in the comments or send it to me. This channel exists thanks to those who dare to tell. And if you enjoy this kind of stories and are not subscribed yet, consider staying. Have a peaceful night. We'll talk soon. I want to share something that I recently received from a listener who signs as Mauricio. He wrote to me from a city in the north, telling me that he has been carrying this story for years and has never found a way to tell it to someone without feeling like they looked at him as if he had lost his mind. So he wrote it to me. If you also have something like that stored away, you know where to find me. What Mauricio experienced happened when he was 32 years old and agreed to stay for a few months at the family home of a co-worker, an old house on the outskirts, while he resolved a housing issue. What he didn't know was that this house had a guest who had been there much longer than either of them, Rodrigo's house was 40 minutes from the center, along a road that during the day seemed perfectly normal and at night acquired that quality of roads that no one uses after a certain hour, not because there is anything wrong with them, but simply because there is no reason to be there. Rodrigo offered me the guest room when he found out I was looking for a place to stay after the owner of my apartment decided to sell it with 2 weeks' notice. It was a genuine gesture. Rodrigo and I had been working at the same company for 3 years. We got along well enough for co-workers, and he lived alone in that big house he had inherited from his parents, which had more space than one person alone needed. "It's temporary," he told me when we agreed. "Whatever you need, no rush." I thanked him. I packed my suitcase, loaded the boxes with the essentials, and moved in on a Saturday in October. The house was 2 stories, probably built in the 60s, with that solidity of construction from back then that made the walls have a thickness that modern houses no longer have. A neglected front garden, a side garage, a large kitchen that smelled of old wood, and on the upper floor, 4 rooms of which Rodrigo used 1 and the other 3 had not been used regularly for years. Mine overlooked the backyard, had a wide window, and a bed that creaked but was comfortable. It wasn't an apartment in the center, but it wasn't bad either. The first few days were about adapting, learning the rhythms of the house, that the water heater took time to heat up, that the 3rd staircase from the bottom creaked with a particular note that after a while I stopped consciously hearing, learning Rodrigo's rhythms as well, who got up early and went to bed late, and who practically disappeared into his room on weekends with music and headphones. It was an easy coexistence, quiet, without complications, until the 2nd week. The first hint was the smell. It was diffuse at first, something I briefly perceived upon entering the hallway of the upper floor, and that disappeared before I could identify it. An organic, damp smell, similar to wet earth or decomposed leaves, which had no obvious source in a house that, although old, was clean and well maintained. I mentioned it to Rodrigo one morning while we were having breakfast. He looked up from his coffee. "What kind of smell?" he asked. I described it as best as I could. Earth, leaves, something organic and cold. Rodrigo nodded slowly, as if the description confirmed something he already knew. "Sometimes it happens," he said. "The house is old. The humidity rises from the foundations at certain times of the year." It was a reasonable explanation. I accepted it. But that night, when I went to the bathroom past midnight, the smell was in the hallway with an intensity that had nothing to do with the dampness of the foundations. It was dense, present, as if something wet and cold had been there recently. And it came from the room at the end of the hallway, the one that always remained closed, the one I had assumed was simply another unused room. I stopped in front of that door. The smell was clearly stronger there. I put my hand on the doorknob. It was cold, much colder than the rest of the things in that October night hallway. I didn't open it. I don't know exactly why. Something in the quality of that cold on the metal of the doorknob made my hand withdraw before I made a conscious decision about it. I went back to my room. I closed the door, and I spent a good while unable to sleep, listening to the silence of the hallway. I asked Rodrigo about that room the next day. It was casual, or at least I tried to make it sound casual. I asked him what was in there, if he kept things, if he used it for anything. Rodrigo took a moment to respond. He was washing the breakfast dishes with his back to me, and that moment of silence was long enough for me to notice that it wasn't the silence of someone thinking about how to describe a storage room. "It was my brother's room," he finally said. I didn't know that Rodrigo had a brother. In 3 years of working together, he had never mentioned him. "Does he live outside?" I asked. Rodrigo took another moment. "He died," he said, "a long time ago, when we were kids." He placed the last dish in the drying rack and dried his hands. "We never used that room after. My parents left it closed and I kept leaving it closed. A habit, I suppose." "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded, with that gesture of someone accepting condolences for something so far in the past that it no longer hurts in the same way but has not completely disappeared either. "There's nothing in there," he said. "Just old furniture." I didn't ask again. But that night, from my room, I heard something coming from that room at the end of the hall. A soft, intermittent sound. It took me a while to identify it. It was the sound of a ball bouncing against the floor. Slow, irregular, like when someone drops it from their hand and catches it before it finishes bouncing. again and again, for maybe 5 minutes, and then nothing. I lay completely still in bed, with my eyes open in the dark, processing what I had just heard. A ball, in the closed room of a child who had been dead for decades. I didn't tell Rodrigo immediately. I needed time to decide if what I had heard had any explanation other than the one my mind was insistently constructing. I spent the following days paying different attention to the house, not in a paranoid way, but simply with more care. And what I noticed when I started looking that way was that there were more things that didn't quite add up. The marks on the hallway wall, at a child's height, that I had seen from the first day without paying attention to them, and that now, looking closely, had the shape of small hands. Not exactly dirt. Marks, as if someone had repeatedly rested their hands on the same spot for a long time. The picture that was on the stairs, which I had passed by hundreds of times without really looking, and which was a family photo, Rodrigo's parents when they were young, with 2 children in front of them. One of them was Rodrigo, recognizable even at that age. The other was a smaller boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, looking at the camera with a serious expression that contrasted with the smiles of the others. And the temperature of the hallway on the upper floor, which was consistently colder than the rest of the house, even with the heating on, even on the warmest days of that October that had not yet finished cooling down. The 4th night after hearing the ball, I heard it again. The same sound, the same rhythm, from the same room, for about the same amount of time. I got up, I stepped out into the hallway. The temperature dropped suddenly as soon as I left my room. That specific cold I had already learned to recognize. The sound of the ball continued, soft and steady, from behind the closed door at the end. I walked over there. I stopped in front of the door. The sound continued for a few more seconds and then stopped. The silence that followed was of that kind that seems to have weight, that occupies space in a way that normal silence does not occupy. I raised my hand toward the doorknob, and then, from the other side of the door, someone said my name. Not in an adult's voice, in a child's voice, clear, calm, without urgency or fear, just my name, pronounced with the naturalness of someone calling to someone they know. I withdrew my hand. I stepped back until my back touched the wall of the hallway across. I stood there without moving for what could have been 2 minutes, although I couldn't have determined it precisely. Absolute silence on the other side of the door. I went down the stairs, entered the kitchen, turned on the light, and sat at the table. And I stayed there until dawn. The next morning, I told Rodrigo everything. No beating around the bush, not looking for a way to soften it. I told him directly, the smell, the sound of the ball, the marks on the wall, and finally what happened that night, my name spoken in a child's voice from behind the closed door. Rodrigo listened to me without interrupting. He had his hands around his coffee cup and was looking at the table while I spoke, with an expression that I didn't quite know how to read until I finished talking. It wasn't surprise. It was something more like the weary acknowledgement of someone confirming something they already knew. "How many times did you hear the ball?" he asked. "Twice," I said, with 4 days in between. He nodded. "It happened to me when I was a kid," he said. "After he died, I heard the ball. I saw things in the hallway at night, a small figure." He paused. "My parents told me it was grief, that it was a child's imagination who had lost his brother. They might have been right. But over the years I stopped hearing the ball and thought it was over." "How did he die?" I asked. Rodrigo took a while. "He was 7 years old," he said. "It was an accident. He fell down the stairs." His eyes briefly went to the stairs in the hallway and returned to the cup. "In this house. On those stairs." The silence that followed was long. "Why do you think it has come back now?" I finally said. Rodrigo looked at me. "I don't know," he said. "Nothing has happened for years." He paused. "Although my mother always said that Diego was looking for company, that he was a very sociable boy, that he didn't like to be alone." Another pause, longer. "And that the house had been empty for a long time. Diego. The dead brother was named Diego, and I was the first person to have slept in that house in years." That information changed something in the way I experienced the house. Not fear exactly, although fear was still there. It was something more complex than that. Because Diego, if it was Diego who inhabited that hallway and that closed room, had not done anything aggressive. He had done exactly what children do: play with their ball, call someone by their name, seek attention, which was, in its own way, even more disturbing than if he had been threatening. Rodrigo asked me if I wanted to leave. He asked me directly without pressure in any direction, with that honesty of his that I appreciated. I told him I wasn't leaving yet. I don't know exactly why I made that decision. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was something harder to name. A kind of curiosity that the situation had ignited in me and that I was still not ready to extinguish. That night I left the door to my room open. I lay in bed with the hallway light coming through the open frame and waited. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. I hadn't rationalized it. I just left the door open and waited. Around 2 in the morning I heard the footsteps. Light, small, irregular, the kind of footsteps that a child's feet make on wood. They were coming down the hallway. They approached my door and stopped at the threshold. I saw nothing. The hallway light illuminated the doorframe and the piece of hallway visible from my bed, and there was nothing there to be seen. But the temperature in the room dropped, that already familiar cold, and the feeling that there was something at that threshold was as concrete and physical as anything I had ever experienced in my life. I stayed still, breathing slowly, and then, in a very low voice, I said, "Hello, Diego." Silence. Then, in the hallway, a soft sound, like something dropping to the floor, and the sound of a ball bouncing, once, twice, and rolling until it stopped, and then nothing else that night. The following weeks were strange in a way that had no precedent in my experience. The house remained the house, Rodrigo remained Rodrigo, work remained work. But there was something more in the routine now. A presence that I had chosen, more or less consciously, not to ignore. The ball would occasionally appear in the hallway, in places where it hadn't been before. I would return it to the threshold of the closed room without making any comments about it. The smell of damp earth came and went. The temperature in the hallway was always colder than the rest, and sometimes, not every night, I would hear footsteps. Rodrigo and I talked about it in more depth one night when we were both awake late. He told me more about Diego, about how lively he had been, a noisy and curious child, one of those who always need to be doing something, always in motion, always with someone nearby, about how the house had changed after his death, that silence that settles in places where something has ended abruptly and never quite goes away. "Did you ever think about doing something?" I asked him. "I don't know. Someone who would come, who would do something." Rodrigo looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly negative. "My mother tried it once," she said, "years after he died. Someone came, did things, said words." She paused. "That week was the worst I remember in this house, as if what they had done was not to calm him but to disturb him. After that, my mother decided it was better to leave him in peace." She looked at me, and I have followed that logic ever since. It was a logic I understood better than I would have expected. The most intense moment occurred on a Sunday afternoon when Rodrigo had gone out and I was alone in the house. I was in the kitchen reading when I heard a sound coming from the upstairs. Not the ball this time. Something different. A dry, unique thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor upstairs. I went up. The hallway was empty and cold as always. Diego's room door was still closed. I checked the other rooms. Everything in order. Nothing fallen. Nothing out of place. I stopped in front of Diego's door. And at that moment, for the first and only time during all the time I spent in that house, the door opened. Slowly. Without violence. As if someone on the other side had turned the knob and gently pushed. The door opened about 30 centimeters and stopped, leaving a partial view into the room. What I saw was exactly what Rodrigo had described. Old furniture, a small bed with the mattress without sheets, a desk with a chair, a dark wooden wardrobe, and on the desk a red rubber ball, the kind that children used decades ago, perfectly still in the center of the wooden surface. That was all. There was no one. The room was empty and still, and smelled exactly like what I had learned to recognize, damp earth and something cold and ancient. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I said softly, "It's okay, Diego," and I carefully closed the door. I left that house 2 months later, when I found an apartment that fit what I was looking for. I said goodbye to Rodrigo on a Saturday morning, loaded my boxes into the car, and before leaving, I went up the hallway on the second floor for the last time. I stopped in front of Diego's door. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that didn't sound ridiculous or insufficient. I just stood there for a moment, with my hand a few inches from the door without touching it. The hallway was cold, as always. And then, very softly, from the other side, the sound of the ball bouncing. Once, twice, and silence. I went down the stairs, shook Rodrigo's hand, and left. That was 2 years ago. Rodrigo still lives in that house. We talk from time to time, and when I ask him about the house, he tells me that everything is the same. The ball in the hallway from time to time, the cold, the smell. He once asked me if I regretted opening the door to my room that night of saying hello. I told him no. And it's true, I don't regret it. But there is something I took away from that experience that doesn't quite fit anywhere comfortable in my head. Diego died at 7 years old. He fell down the stairs, and he has been in that house, in that room for decades, playing alone with his ball, seeking company. That is what weighs on me the most about everything I experienced there. Not the fear, not the moments of panic in the dark hallway, but that. A child who doesn't want to be alone and who has been alone for more years than I have lived. That is what Mauricio told me, and that is what I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I read it. End of Mauricio's testimony. He wrote to me at the end of the message that he hasn't returned to Rodrigo's house, but that he sometimes thinks about Diego and that red ball on the desk. I believe there is something in this story that touches something different from the usual fear, something closer to sadness. If something similar happened to you, if you ever felt someone's presence in a place who didn't want to leave, write to me or leave it in the comments. Every story has its own weight. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe. There are many more stories like this waiting to be heard. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. There are stories that one receives and needs a moment before narrating. This is one of them. It was sent to me by a follower named Andres from Venezuela, and what he describes happened during a job he accepted out of necessity in a town in the interior of the country. Andres did not believe in demons. He also did not believe in pacts. But there are things that one sees with their own eyes that leave them no choice but to reconsider everything they thought they knew. If you have a story that has marked you like this, write to me. I love receiving your accounts. And if you are hearing this for the first time and you like this type of content, welcome. Now, let's go with what happened to Andres the night he entered the wrong house. I was 29 years old when I accepted that job, and now I am 36. And there are still nights when I wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding in my chest, not knowing exactly why. My body remembers even if I try to forget. My name is Andres, I am an electrician, and at that time I was doing contract work in different parts of the country because the economic situation didn't allow for much choice. When I was called for an electrical remodeling project in Cumaná in the state of Sucre, I accepted without thinking twice. 3 weeks of work, accommodation included, reasonable pay. It was exactly what I needed at that moment in my life. The project was in a large house on the outskirts of the historic center, owned by a gentleman named Don Esteban who lived in Caracas and wanted to remodel the property to rent it out. The house had been vacant for several years, and the electrical installation was a disaster. Old wiring, damaged panels, outlets that did not meet any current standards. It was a thorough job, one that I enjoy because it requires attention and cannot be done halfway. The accommodation the contractor found was a guest house 6 blocks from the house. Clean, basic, with breakfast included. The owner of the guest house was a woman in her 60s named Doña Petra, short, quick in her movements, and with a gaze that seemed to assess you in seconds. On the first day when I told her which house I was going to work at, she paused for a moment. "The house of Esteban Vargas?" she said. "The one on Bolivar Alley?" "That's the one," I said. Doña Petra nodded slowly with an expression I couldn't quite read at that moment but learned to recognize over time as caution. "Finish that job quickly," she said, "and don't stay after dark." I asked her why. "That house has a reputation," she said simply, and changed the subject. I didn't think much of it. Old houses always have a reputation. It's part of being old. The first day of work was completely normal. I arrived at 8 in the morning with my toolbox, inspected the existing installation, made the diagnosis, took measurements and planned the materials. The house was large, 2 stories with high ceilings and thick walls like those built in the past. It smelled of confinement and stopped time, that characteristic smell of spaces that have been uninhabited for a long time. The windows had been closed for who knows how long, and when I opened some to ventilate, the light that came in showed me the dust floating in the air like suspended snow. Nothing unusual, nothing that warranted any warning. I worked until 6 in the evening, gathered my things, and went to the boarding house. I had dinner with Mrs. Petra and 2 other guests, a traveling salesman and a university student, and I went to bed early because the work for the next day was going to be long. The second day was just as quiet. The third one, too. I was getting used to the rhythm of work, to the house, to its own noises of old wood that expands with the heat and contracts at night. I learned its sounds like one learns the sounds of any space where one spends hours. It was in the afternoon of the 4th day when I noticed the room. It was on the upper floor, at the end of the hallway, with the door closed. It was no different from the other doors in the hallway, same size, same dark wood. But when I went to open it to inspect the interior electrical installation, the doorknob wouldn't turn. It was locked. I noted it down on my to-do list to report to the contractor. I needed to check that room too. I couldn't leave it out of the work without a reason. That afternoon, back at the boarding house, I mentioned the locked room to Mrs. Petra. Mrs. Petra looked up from her things and looked at me. "What room?" she asked. "The one at the end of the upstairs hallway, to the left." Doña Petra placed what she had in her hands on the table with a care that seemed deliberate to me. "Don't open that room," she said. "I have to check the electrical installation of the whole house, Doña Petra. That includes that room. Tell the contractor that that room has no wiring," she said. "It has always been that way. It doesn't need checking." I looked at her for a moment. "How do you know that?" Doña Petra held my gaze. "I've been in this neighborhood since I was born, Andres. I've known that house since before you were born." I asked her what was in that room. Doña Petra fell silent for several seconds. Then, in a lower tone, she said, "The previous owner of that house was a man named Celestino Mora. He died 12 years ago. Celestino was a practitioner. Do you know what that means?" I told her I wasn't sure. "He made deals," said Doña Petra, "with things that don't have pretty names. That room was where he worked, where he received them. After Celestino died, no one has been able to enter there without something happening." "What kind of things happen?" "It depends on the person," she said. "But they are never good things." That night I took longer than usual to fall asleep. Part of me, the rational and practical part that has always been dominant, dismissed what Mrs. Petra had told me as local superstition. Neighborhood legends, the kind of story that grows around an old house with an eccentric owner until it becomes unrecognizable. I had seen that before in other places, how a simple story becomes layered with each repetition until it seems monstrous. But there was something in the way Mrs. Petra spoke that was not the tone of someone repeating legends. It was the tone of someone reporting facts. The next day I spoke with the contractor, a man named Eduardo, who coordinated the work from Caracas over the phone. I told him there was a locked room on the upper floor that I needed access to. Eduardo was straightforward. Don Esteban said that room stays as it is, not to include it in the work. Why? He didn't explain. He just said to leave it. So we leave it, Andres. Continue with the rest. I left her. In the following days, I made progress with the rest of the house. The electrical installation was complex but manageable, and the work was going well. I got used to the space, to its proportions, to the way the light changed hour by hour. It was a house that had once been beautiful and could be again with work and attention. The problem started in the second week. It was a sound at first. I heard it on a Tuesday afternoon, when it was almost 6 and I was picking up tools on the ground floor. A soft, repeated thump coming from above, like someone walking very slowly on the upper floor, with heavy and slow steps on the wooden boards. I stood still listening. The steps continued. They moved back and forth along the upper corridor, unhurried, with that mechanical regularity that sounds have when there is no intention behind them, that are just the physics of a moving object. I went up the stairs. The corridor was empty. No one. Nothing out of place. The doors all closed, just as I had left them. Complete silence. I checked every open room. Nothing. I told myself, old wood, temperature, expansion, and contraction. I told myself this with conviction, and I believed it. The next day the steps returned, at the same time, with the same rhythm. On the third day, I stayed on the upper floor waiting for them. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall and waited. At 5:40 in the afternoon, punctual as something with a fixed schedule, the footsteps began. And they were coming from the closed room, not from the hallway, not from any open space, from inside the locked room at the end on the left, Celestino Mora's room, which according to Mrs. Petra was better left unopened. I got up and approached the door. The footsteps continued on the other side, now clearly audible, clearly coming from that closed space. Footsteps of someone walking back and forth in a small room. A deliberate rhythm, almost like that of someone who is waiting. "Who is there?" I said. The footsteps stopped. Absolute silence for several seconds. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard something that sent chills down my spine with an efficiency I had never experienced before. A breath, long, slow, deep, like someone was just on the other side of the wood, face pressed against it, breathing. I stepped away from the door and walked down the stairs without running, because something inside me said that running would be a mistake. I left the house, locked the gate with the padlock they had given me, and walked the 6 blocks to the boarding house without looking back. I told Mrs. Petra what I had heard. She listened without interrupting, with that expression of hers that suggests she already knows the end of the story before you get there. "Did you get close to the door?" she asked when I finished. "Yes." "Did you put your hand on the doorknob?" "No." Mrs. Petra briefly closed her eyes. "Good," she said. "If you didn't touch the doorknob, you didn't accept anything. That's how it works. As long as you don't open, there's no invitation." "Invitation for what?" Doña Petra took a moment before responding. She got up, went to the kitchen, and returned with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of me. It was late for coffee, but I accepted it. "Celestino Mora was a man who sought things," said Doña Petra, sitting down. "He had money, he had time, and he had a curiosity that knew no prudent limits. He started with minor things, what we call jobs here, bindings, cleansings, things that people know. But Celestino wanted more than that. He wanted to talk to something that would truly respond to him. And did he find it? He found it," said Doña Petra. "He spent several years searching, according to what his sister once told me, who was the only person close to him during that time and still lives in the neighborhood. He traveled, learned, brought things from other places. And at some point in that process, something in that room responded." "What kind of something?" "The guy who has no name, that one would want to say out loud," said Mrs. Petra, and she said it without drama, as a technical fact. "Celestino made a deal with him. He asked for things that I won't detail because it's not my story to tell. And for years he lived well, very well, according to the people in the neighborhood. Prosperity, health, things he didn't have before." "And the payment?" Mrs. Petra took her coffee. "The payment arrived when Celestino died," he said. "But it turns out that what he left behind in that room didn't only take him. It also took those who came after. 2 families have tried to live in that house in the 12 years that the property has been changing hands. None lasted more than 2 months. What happened to them? To the first family, the father started having dreams that weren't his, dreams that left him so exhausted that by the 2nd month he couldn't work. They left. To the second family, the mother said she heard voices giving her instructions. They left before the 1st month. It was after that that Don Esteban bought the property cheap with the idea of remodeling it without living in it and renting it to people who didn't know the history. I remained silent, processing that. "And what's inside that room now?" I asked. "What has always been there," said Mrs. Petra, "and will continue to be there as long as no one moves it, confronts it, or opens that door. Sometimes you hear it, sometimes you feel it, but as long as no one enters, it stays inside." "Like the mirror of your history," I said without thinking. Mrs. Petra looked at me without understanding the reference, because it was only mine. "As long as you don't open, there's no invitation." I repeated her words. "Exactly," she said. "Finish your work and leave, Andres. This is not your story." The following days I spent with that in my head. I kept working, I kept progressing, and the footsteps continued every afternoon at the same time. I got used to them in a way that does not make me proud. I listened to them, mentally registered them, and continued with my own. Like Mrs. Petra, one learns not to listen. But on the night of the 14th day, something changed. That night I made a mistake. I had forgotten a tool at home. A specific tool that I needed early the next day and that I didn't have a duplicate of. I noticed it while having dinner at the boarding house, and I figured that if I went quickly, I could pick it up and come back in no more than 20 minutes. It was 9:30 at night. Doña Petra was in her room when I left. I didn't warn her. I didn't want the conversation that would have followed if I told her where I was going. I walked the 6 blocks in the warm night of Cumaná. The neighborhood was quiet, some houses with lights on, the distant sound of a television, dogs barking at something invisible. I arrived at the gate of the house, unlocked it, and entered. The ground floor was dark. I took out my phone's flashlight and used it to orient myself. I found the tool exactly where I had left it, in the kitchen, on the counter where I had been working that afternoon. I picked it up and headed towards the gate, and then I heard something. Not the usual footsteps. Something different. A sound coming from the upper floor, from the hallway, but it wasn't the familiar rhythm of footsteps. It was more like a dragging sound, as if something very heavy was slowly moving across the wooden floor of the hallway above. I stopped. The dragging continued, slow and deliberate, moving from the back room toward the beginning of the hallway, toward the stairs. I didn't look up. I kept my gaze straight ahead, at the gate that was about 6 meters from where I was, and I walked toward it with steady steps. I didn't run. I told myself not to run. That urgent movement was a sign of recognition, that if something expected a reaction, giving it one was the worst thing I could do. I reached the gate. I put my hand on the latch. And then I heard, from the top of the stairs, a voice. It wasn't the breathing from last time. It was a complete voice, clear, with a strange cadence but perfectly articulated. It didn't say words that I could recognize as words. It was a language that didn't exist in any dictionary I knew, with a musicality that had something of singing and something of threat, both at the same time. I unlocked the bolt, went out, closed the gate, and walked the 6 blocks back to the boarding house. I didn't run, but when I arrived at the boarding house and entered and closed the door behind me, I sat in the first armchair I found and took several minutes to be able to breathe normally. Doña Petra came out of her room. She looked at me. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water. She gave it to me. She sat in front of me and waited. When I could speak, I told her what had happened. Doña Petra listened. When I finished, she asked me one thing. "Did you open any door inside?" "No," I said. "I just picked up the tool and left." "Did you respond to the voice?" "No." Doña Petra nodded. "Then you are fine," she said. "You didn't open, you didn't respond. There is no invitation." What would have happened if I had responded? Doña Petra looked at me for a moment. "I don't know for sure," she said. "No one who has responded has been able to explain it well afterward." I finished the work in 4 more days. I worked quickly, faster than I was used to, and I left that house every afternoon before the footsteps began. I didn't return at night. I didn't forget any tools. On the last day, before I left for good, I stopped for a moment in the hallway on the upper floor. I looked towards the back room. The door was closed, silent, with nothing visible to distinguish it from any other ordinary door. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe closure. Maybe I just wanted to see it in the daylight, with light, with my tools in hand and the gate open behind me, to tell myself that it was just wood and hinges and an old lock. I looked at it for a long moment. And from the other side, very softly, almost inaudible, 3 knocks came. Spaced out, slow, like a response. I turned around, went down the stairs, left the house, and closed the gate for the last time. That afternoon, at the boarding house, while I was packing my suitcase, Doña Petra appeared at the door of my room. "Are you almost done?" she asked. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said. Doña Petra nodded. Then she said something I never forgot. Celestino's sister once told me that when he made the deal, the condition was that whatever came into that room could stay as long as no one took it out, and that the only way to get it out was to offer it something in return. Offer it what? That's what no one has wanted to find out, Doña Petra said, and that's why it's still there. I left Cumaná the next day. I took the first available bus and didn't look back when the neighborhood disappeared among the houses and palm trees of the coast. 7 years have passed. Sometimes I think about that room, about what is inside it, still and patient, waiting for someone to open the door and answer the voice. About how many people must have passed through that house since then without knowing what is at the end of the hallway. I don't know if Mr. Esteban managed to rent it. I don't know if anyone lives there now. I didn't seek to find out because there are questions whose answers change nothing, they just weigh you down more. What I do know is this. In the jobs I did afterwards, in the old houses with rooms locked with keys, I learned a rule that I keep without exception. If the door is locked, I first ask why. And if the answer has too many doubts, or too much silence, or the tone of someone who knows more than they say, I leave the door as it is. As long as you don't open it, there is no invitation. That's all Andres wanted to share. He wrote to me that since that experience, he has changed the way he does his work, and that he has learned to read the warnings that people give without finishing what they are saying. That skill, he says, has saved him from more than one problem. There are things in this world that work with very simple rules, and the most important of all seems to always be the same. What you do not invite cannot enter. Thanks to Andres for sharing this. If you also have a story that you have kept inside and feel deserves to be heard, write to me. There is space for everyone. We'll talk soon. Take care. This experience was sent to me by a follower named Andres, who spent 3 summers working as a night caretaker in a pre-Columbian art museum in Lima, Peru. What he discovered about one of the pieces in the collection and the visits he received after closing led him to abruptly leave the job without giving explanations. If you have ever worked alone in museums, galleries, or archives at night and felt that ancient pieces have something more than historical value, tell me in the comments. This is the story of Andres and the idol that should never have been unearthed. My name is Andres, and during 3 summers while studying archaeology at university, I worked as a night watchman at the Museum of Ancestral Cultures in Lima. It was a perfect job for me. I could study during the quiet hours, the pay was decent, and being surrounded by ancient artifacts fueled my passion for archaeology. The museum was small but prestigious, specializing in pre-Columbian pieces from cultures such as the Moche, Nazca, Chavin, and Inca. 3 floors of galleries filled with ceramics, textiles, gold tools, and the most impressive, a collection of stone idols dating back more than 2,000 years. My shift was from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Basically, I walked through the museum every hour, checked that all the doors and windows were secure, monitored the security cameras, and the rest of the time I could read or study in the surveillance office. The first 2 summers were completely normal. The museum at night was quiet, a bit unsettling perhaps with all those ancient figures staring at you from their display cases, but nothing that a rationalist archaeology student like me couldn't handle. Everything changed the 3rd summer when they brought in the new acquisition. It was a stone idol from the Chavin culture, found in a recent excavation in the northern mountains. It measured approximately 60 centimeters in height, carved from black volcanic stone. It represented a humanoid figure with feline features, almond-shaped eyes, prominent fangs, claws instead of hands. The Chavin were known for their art that blended humans with jaguars, snakes, and eagles. But this idol was different. There was something in its expression, in the way its carved eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you looked at it from. And unlike other pieces in the museum that emanated a sense of history and antiquity, this idol emanated something more. Something that made your skin crawl when you got too close. Dr. Vargas, the museum director, was excited about the acquisition. He called me to see it before it was installed in its display case on the 3rd floor. "It's exceptional, Andres," he said, his eyes shining with academic enthusiasm. "Archaeologists believe it was a central idol of worship. Look at these marks on the base. They are stains of what was probably blood, preserved by the mineral composition of the stone. They made sacrifices in front of this idol." I approached to examine the stains. They were a dark reddish-brown, deeply embedded in the porous stone. Many stains, layers upon layers, suggesting decades or centuries of rituals. "What kind of sacrifices?" I asked. "The Chavin mainly sacrificed llamas and guinea pigs," Dr. Vargas replied. But there is evidence that in special rituals, particularly in times of crisis like droughts or wars, they also made human sacrifices. I looked into the eyes of the idol. They seemed hungry. "When will you install it?" I asked. "Tomorrow. It will occupy the central place in the Chavin Gallery on the third floor. It's going to attract many visitors once we announce its acquisition." That night, the idol remained in the preparation room in the basement, waiting to be cleaned and cataloged before its exhibition. I made my usual rounds, but I found myself avoiding the basement. There was no logical reason for it, just a feeling that I preferred not to be near that thing more than necessary. Around 3 in the morning, while I was in the security office, I heard something on the camera monitors. A sound, low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. I checked the screens. Everything seemed normal. The galleries were empty, the showcases intact. But the sound continued, clearly picked up by the camera's microphones. I took my flashlight and my radio and began my verification round. The sound was louder on the third floor. It seemed to come from the Chavin Gallery, although that didn't make sense because the new idol had not yet been installed there. I entered the gallery. The other Chavin pieces were in their places, ceramics with jaguar designs, ancient textiles carefully preserved, copper tools, everything normal. But the chanting continued. And now that I was in the gallery, I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below, from the basement. I went down the stairs to the preparation room in the basement. The door was closed as I had left it, but the chanting was definitely coming from inside. I opened the door slowly. The room was dark except for the emergency light above the door. The idol was where they had left it, on a work table in the center of the room. And around the table, barely visible in the dim light, there were figures. They were not solid. They were like three-dimensional shadows, human shapes without defined features. And they were kneeling around the idol, swaying, and the chant was coming from them. They were not words in any language I knew. They were guttural, rhythmic sounds that resonated at frequencies that made my teeth ache. I turned on the main light in the room. The figures disappeared instantly. The chant stopped. Only the idol remained, sitting innocently on its table, its stone eyes looking at me with what I swear was a hint of amusement. I convinced myself that I had been daydreaming, that the exhaustion from studying for my final exams was making me hallucinate. I closed the room and returned to the office, determined not to think about it anymore. But on the following nights, it happened again. The chant, the shadow figures, always around 3 in the morning, always in the basement near the idol. And after they installed the idol on the 3rd floor in its specially designed glass case, the apparitions moved with it. Now the figures appeared in the Chavin Gallery, kneeling in front of the case, continuing their ancient ritual. I began to investigate. I searched the museum library for everything I could find about Chavin culture and its religious practices. What I discovered deeply unsettled me. The Chavin did not only worship their idols. They believed that the idols were inhabited by powerful spirits, entities that existed on a plane between the physical and the spiritual world. The Chavin priests acted as intermediaries, feeding these spirits with sacrifices and receiving in return power, knowledge, or favor. But there were warnings in the ancient texts. If an idol was not fed properly, if the ritual ceased, the spirit within would become hungry, restless, and it would begin to seek sustenance for itself. This particular idol had been unearthed from a temple that had been abruptly abandoned around the year 200 AD. The archaeologists did not know why the temple was abandoned. Theories included natural disasters, war, or social collapse. But the excavation records mentioned something strange. They had found skeletons in the temple, many skeletons, all in positions that suggested they had died during rituals. And all the skeletons showed signs of having died from violent causes not immediately before death, but over an extended period, as if they had been consumed slowly. One night, about 2 weeks after the idol was installed, the apparitions changed. The shadow figures no longer just knelt and sang. Now they moved through the museum. I saw them on the security cameras, gliding through the halls, examining other display cases, going up and down stairs. And they began to approach me. The first time someone approached me directly, I was on the 2nd floor doing my rounds. I felt a sudden chill, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I turned around and there it was, a shadowy figure less than a meter away. It had no face, but I could feel it watching me, studying me, evaluating me. I stepped back and stumbled into a display case. The figure moved closer, and then I heard a voice, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. The devourer is hungry. It hasn't fed in centuries. You could serve it. What? I managed to say out loud. Or you could serve in another way. Restore the rituals, feed it properly, become its priest in this new era. The figure extended what could be an arm towards me. I didn't want to know what would happen if it touched me. I ran. I ran down the stairs out of the building into the street. I stayed outside until dawn, trembling on a bench in a nearby park. I should have resigned that morning. But I was young, stupid, and proud. I thought I could handle this. That, as an archaeology student, I had to investigate this phenomenon, document it, understand it. So I went back the next night. The shadow figures were waiting for me. Dozens of them now, filling the museum. And they all moved with purpose, as if they were preparing something. I went straight to the Shavin gallery on the 3rd floor. The idol was in its display case, but something had changed. The bloodstains on its base looked darker, fresher, and the carved eyes had a sheen that hadn't been there before. "You've returned," said the voice in my mind. "Good. The devourer has chosen you. You can feel it, can't you? The pull, the call." And the worst part was that it was right. There was something about the idol that drew me in, like a magnet, pulling not my body but something deeper, my will, my soul. "What does it want from me?" I asked. "Renew the pact." The ancient priests fed the devourer, and in return received power over life and death, visions of the future, knowledge of hidden secrets. You could have the same. What price? A sacrifice every new moon, blood for the devourer. At first, small animals. Eventually, greater offerings. "Human sacrifice," I said, feeling sick. "You're asking me to kill people." The devourer does not distinguish. Blood is blood. Life is life. And those who serve the devourer are generously rewarded. One of the shadow figures partially solidified, taking on a more defined shape. It was a man, or had been one long ago. He wore the ceremonial robes of a Shavin priest. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep hollow. "I served the devourer for 40 years, he said in a raspy voice. "I saw the future, controlled the harvests, healed diseases. The power was intoxicating. And now?" I asked. "What are you now?" "An eternal servant. When I died, my soul did not pass. It remains here bound to the devourer, fulfilling his will until he finds a successor to continue the pact." "How long have you waited?" 1,800 years. The number hit me. 1,800 years tied to this idol, waiting, serving, unable to find peace. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. The shadow figures moved closer. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. "The devourer is hungry," the dead priest repeated. "If you do not serve willingly, you will serve in another way, as food." I felt something pulling at me, not physically, but on a spiritual level, as if something were trying to tear my soul from my body. The pain was indescribable, like being ripped apart from the inside. I fell to my knees, struggling against the sensation, and in that moment of panic and agony, I remembered something I had read in one of the ancient texts about Shavin culture. The idols were powerful, yes, but their power came from belief, from worship, from sacrifices. Without these, they were just stone. And there was a way to break their dominion, deny their divinity, reject their power, assert that they were nothing more than objects carved by mortal hands. "No," I said, forcing the words through the pain. "You are not a god. You are not the devourer. You are just stone. A rock carved by dead humans long ago. You have no power over me." The pull intensified as if the entity were furious at my rejection. "You have no power," I repeated louder now. "You are nothing, and I do not fear you." The shadow figures began to scream, a sharp and terrible sound that filled the museum. The idol in its display case began to vibrate, the bloodstains on its base glowing with sickly red light. But I continued. "I do not recognize you. I do not worship you. I do not feed you. You are nothing to me." With each word, the pain diminished. The pull weakened, and the shadow figures began to fade, their forms becoming less substantial. The dead priest looked at me with what could have been desperation. "Please," he pleaded. If I do not find a successor, I must serve forever. Please. But I stood firm. I am not your successor, and your pact ends here. With one last cry of frustration and fury, the figures disappeared completely. The idol stopped vibrating. The red glow faded, and I was left alone in the gallery, trembling but free. I quit that morning. I didn't wait until the end of my shift. I simply left my keys and my ID on Dr. Vargas's desk with a note saying that I had a family emergency and could not continue. He tried to contact me for weeks, offering me more pay, flexible hours, anything to get me back. I never responded. I have followed the news about the museum since then. The idol is still on display, and I have noticed something interesting. Every few months, there is a new story about some problem. A security guard who quit without explanation. A curator who had a nervous breakdown. A visitor who collapsed in front of the idol's display case and was taken to the hospital. And 6 months ago, there was a darker piece of news. An archaeology student who was interning at the museum disappeared. He was last seen on the 3rd floor in the Chavin Gallery late at night. His body was never found. The case remains unsolved. The police have no leads. The museum has intensified security, but they still have no answers. I have my suspicions. I believe the devourer finally found someone less strong, less skeptical, more vulnerable to its promises of power. Someone who accepted the pact that I rejected. And now, there is a new priest serving a 2,000-year-old stone god in the heart of modern Lima, performing ancient rituals in secret, feeding the devourer with sacrifices that no one notices because the modern world does not believe in these things. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more, if I should have tried to destroy the idol, warn the museum, something. But who would have believed me? And what could I do against something that has existed and accumulated power for millennia? What I did do was change my career. I no longer study archaeology. Now I study the history of comparative religions, specifically the psychological aspects of belief systems. It's my way of understanding what I experienced without having to face it directly again. But I know the truth. I know that there are things in museums around the world that are more than mere artifacts. They are anchors for ancient entities, for pacts that transcend time, for powers that modern civilization has forgotten but not eliminated. And I know that every night, on the 3rd floor of the Museum of Ancestral Cultures in Lima, shadow figures kneel before a glass display case, singing in dead tongues, feeding something that should never have been unearthed. The devourer is still hungry, and now it has a new priest to satisfy that hunger. I can only hope that whoever accepted the pact eventually understands what I came to realize, that serving these ancient forces does not bring true power, only eternal slavery. But by then, it will probably be too late. The pact will have been renewed, and the cycle will continue for another 1,000 years. That's all Andres wanted to share about his experience. He told me he still has nightmares about the idol and completely avoids museums now, even during the day. If you have ever worked in museums, archives, or ancient collections and felt that certain objects have a presence of their own, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes what we preserve from the past includes more than history. Rest well. See you soon. I have here the testimony of a listener who signs as Patricia from Bolivia. She wrote to me that what she is about to share happened when she was 51 years old, during a trip she took alone to a town where her family had lived generations ago. She says she went to seek her roots and found something that no one had warned her about. If you have a family story that hides more than it seems, I would love to read it below. Now this is what Patricia discovered. I went to Altamira to seek my dead. Not literally, although with what happened afterward, that phrase takes on a meaning that it did not have at that moment. I went because I had wanted to do it for years, and because at 51, one begins to understand that things that are indefinitely postponed end up never happening. I went because my mother, before she died, had spoken to me several times about that town, with a mix of nostalgia and something harder to name, something like guilt, or the relief of someone who left something behind and is not completely sure it was right to leave it. Altamira was the town where my maternal grandmother was born, and my grandmother's mother, and that mother's mother. A line of women who had lived in that place for generations until my grandmother left it at 20 with my grandfather and never returned. Never. In 50 years of adult life, My grandmother did not go back to Altamira even once. When we asked her why, she said there was nothing to see anymore, that everything that had been that place for her was left in the past, and that the past was better left undisturbed. I never understood that, until I went. Altamira was about 6 hours from the city where I live, by road. It was a medium-sized town by the standards of the region, with a central square, a colonial church, and a market on Sundays. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in my own car, with a reservation at a small inn I had found online that had 3 stars and photographs showing clean rooms and a courtyard with flowers. What the photographs did not show was what I felt upon entering the town. It was nothing concrete. There was no visible sign, no sound, no particular smell. It was simply a feeling that the air changed upon crossing the boundary of the town. It became denser, quieter, like the air in a closed space that has been that way for a long time. And with that, a very slight discomfort that I attributed to the fatigue of the journey and the weight of being in a place that carried all the meaning I had given it before knowing it. I settled into the inn. The lady who managed it was named Doña Inés, a woman of about 65 years with her hair tied up and working hands. She asked me for my last name for the register, as is customary, and when I said it, she looked at me in a way that lasted barely a second but that I noticed. "Family from here?" she asked. "On my mother's side," I said. "My grandmother was from Altamira. She was born here." Doña Inés nodded and continued with the registration without saying anything else. That night I had dinner at a restaurant in the square and went to bed early. In the morning I planned to go to the civil registry to look for documents about my ancestors, and to the cemetery to find the graves of those who had lived in that town before me. I slept well that first night. No dreams, or at least none that I remembered upon waking. The civil registry opened at 9. The official who attended to me, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, searched the system for my grandmother's last name and then in the physical files, which for the older years were still on paper and not digital. He found records, several, spanning multiple generations. Births, marriages, deaths. I documented everything in a notebook, that chain of names and dates that builds the history of a family in a way that no family conversation ever fully captures. It was in one of those documents that I found the first thing I didn't expect. The death record of a woman who had died 120 years ago, my grandmother's grandmother, according to the chain I was reconstructing. The cause of death was noted in the formal handwriting of the records from that time. The official helped me read it because the paper was deteriorated and the writing was difficult. The cause of death noted was consumption by pact. I stared at that phrase. "What does that mean?" I asked the official. She read the document again, frowning. "I don't know," she said. "It's a rare notation. Normally at that time they would write disease, accident. This is unusual." I photographed the document and continued reviewing. In the cemetery that afternoon, I found the graves without much difficulty. They were in the oldest section, with stone tombstones that time had partially covered with lichen, and that had that appearance of things that have been waiting a long time for someone to visit them. I kept photographing them, reading the names, connecting the dates with what I had found in the civil registry. It was a quiet and somewhat emotional task. These were my dead, people I had not known but who were part of who I was. I arrived at the oldest grave I found with my last name, that of the woman whose death record said consumption by pact. The tombstone was simple, just the name and the dates, but it had something engraved underneath that the others didn't have. A small symbol at the bottom edge of the stone, partially covered by lichen. I carefully cleaned it with a damp cloth. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, with curved edges and lines that crossed in a way that wasn't decorative. It had the quality of symbols that mean something specific to those who know them and mean nothing to those who don't. I photographed it too. That night at the inn, reviewing the photos on my phone, I showed the symbol to Mrs. Inez, who was at the reception when I passed by. She looked at the photo for a moment. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In a grave in the cemetery, my family." Mrs. Inez returned the phone to me. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "I was thinking of staying until Sunday," I said. She nodded slowly. "There is a woman in the village," she said. "Her name is Doña Remedios. She lives on the street that goes down to the river, the second house with a green gate. She knows about these things. If you want to understand what you found, go see her tomorrow." What kind of things does she know? The ones from here, said Doña Inés. The ones from this town in particular. I went to see Doña Remedios the next morning. She was an older woman who seemed to be older than she probably was, with that appearance that people sometimes have when they have carried heavy things for a long time. Her house was small and tidy and smelled of herbs I couldn't identify. She let me in without asking who I was or what I wanted, as if she were expecting me. I showed her the photo of the symbol on the tomb. Doña Remedios looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "What is your last name?" she asked. I told her. She nodded, with the expression of someone confirming something they already suspected. "Your family has a history in this town," she said. "Not all of it, but an important part. Do you know anything about it?" "Only that my grandmother left 50 years ago and never returned." "Your grandmother left because she knew," said Doña Remedios. "Or at least she suspected. The women in her family always knew, one way or another. The problem is that knowing is not enough to break what is done." "What is done?" Doña Remedios got up and went to a cupboard from which she took out a thick book with leather covers, which she placed on the table between the two of them. 140 years ago, he said, a woman from her family made a deal. I don't know the exact details. No one knows them entirely, but the outcome is documentable. From that deal, the female line of that family had certain things: prosperity, health. The daughters were born well, grew up well, lived well, for several generations. And the price? The price was that something would have the right to be close. Not inside, not controlling. Close. Observing. And every certain number of generations, claiming one. He fell silent for a moment. "Your grandmother's grandmother was the first to pay," he continued. "That's the one that says consumption by pact in the record. She died young, and in a way that the doctors of that time could not explain. After her, there were others. Not always deaths. Sometimes it was something different. One that got lost, one that went mad, one that disappeared without explanation. The chain continues." "Did my grandmother know?" "Her grandmother knew that if she stayed in Altamira, where the bond is anchored, the proximity was greater. That distancing does not break the bond but weakens it." Doña Remedios looked directly at me. "You came here, voluntarily, and you brought your surname with you." The silence that followed was heavy. "What does that mean?" I asked. "That what is anchored here recognized you when you entered the town," she said. "That now it knows you exist and where you are." "And what do I do?" Doña Remedios opened the thick book and searched through its pages until she reached a section marked with a piece of cloth. "There is a way to notify oneself," she said. "Not to break, as that would require things that are no longer available, but to establish that you came voluntarily, that you honored the debt with your presence, and that you can leave. Sometimes that is enough for the cycle not to advance upon you." "Sometimes? I have no certainties," she said. "Just experience." We did what Doña Remedios indicated that afternoon. We returned to the cemetery, to the grave with the symbol. Doña Remedios brought things that I will not describe in detail because she asked me not to. What I can say is that something was said aloud directed at the stone, and that I repeated certain words when she indicated me to, and that at some point during that process, the temperature in that section of the cemetery dropped in a way that did not correspond to the wind or the shadow of any tree, and then it rose again, gradually, until it was the normal temperature of an October afternoon. Doña Remedios said it was enough. I stayed that night longer and left the next day, a Saturday, a day earlier than planned. On the way back, halfway through the route, I stopped to get gas. While I waited, I looked at my phone and found a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "You can leave now." There was no name. The number, when I tried to look it up later, didn't match any known contact. And when I tried to call it, the tone was of a non-existent line. I never found out who that message was from. I didn't ask either. I got home that night and called a cousin, the only relative from that line I have left, and I told her what I had found. Not everything, but enough. I told her I had information about the family, documents, photographs, that whenever she wanted, we could talk. My cousin listened in silence and finally said, "My mother always said that we shouldn't go to that town." "And did you know why?" "Not exactly," she said. "But there are things you learn not to ask about. I keep thinking about that, about how much the women in my family knew that chose not to say anything, about whether the silence was a protection or if it was the silence that allowed the story to keep repeating itself without anyone interrupting it. I have no answer for that. What I do know is that since I returned from Altamira, something has changed. Not in the world outside, but in me. A kind of awareness that certain things exist and that ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. My grandmother knew it. That's why she left. I went, and I think I survived, I believe. This is where Patricia wanted to share. She told me that writing it took her months, that there were parts she didn't know how to put into words. She succeeded. If you have a family history that holds secrets that no one can fully explain, or if you ever went to search for your roots and found more than you expected, tell me in the comments. I love reading those stories. And if you stayed listening until now, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Rest well. We'll talk soon.